Good morning, Solid Christian Church, and our brothers and sisters around the world, wherever you may be listening in on our sermon today, and certainly our brothers and sisters in Buffalo, Oklahoma. Get out your Bibles and flip over to the book of Ruth today as we continue on with our examination and study of each book of the Bible and how God reveals himself on a large scale to us through each one of these books, and how we can identify who we are and what our role is in relationship to God. So far in our study, we've looked at the book of Judges, which really detailed that God is the sovereign judge. We looked at Joshua, that God is the victorious warrior and God who is faithful to us. Deuteronomy also shows that theme, that God is a faithful God, and he raises up a faithful generation of believers. Numbers showed us that God chastises those who are rebellious. That Leviticus, that God is a holy God. That Exodus taught us that God is the rescuing God. And in our first study, we examined that God is the creator God, and that everything in the Bible revolves around him. Well, today, as we get into this 8th book of our study, the book of Ruth, we're going to see another fantastic characteristic of our God as he reveals himself to us through a family dynamic of tragedy. Follow along with me in your Bibles, Ruth chapter 1. We're not going to read all of this. Let's just get a good start going right here. Now, in those days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and there was a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and his 2 sons, who lived there to live a while in the country of Moab. And the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and his names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab to live there. Today, as we get into this book and study it, what we want you to know is how God reveals himself to us in the book of Ruth, and that when trials and sorrows abound, God gives us hope through his presence and brings relief to us as a redeeming God. When trials and sorrows abound, simply put, God is present to give us hope, brothers and sisters. And so in this story that we are going to look at, we're going to look at 3 stages of development. And as we clarify each one of those stages, represented actually by one of the 3 major characters in this story, we will then come to the conclusion of how God reveals himself as the major character of this story. So let's get to it. First point that I want to make is this. The world that we live in creates great sources of suffering to us, but never hopelessness. Now, if we continued on, we would see that God has allowed a terrible tragedy to happen in the life of Naomi. And it certainly brings up that not only are we mortal, but brothers and sisters, what we do with our time matters greatly. Are we living our life in a manner that would be pleasing to God? So if today was our last day, if tomorrow was our last day on this earth, that we could look back and say, man, we lived a productive life for God. Because we know it doesn't matter how old you are, where you're from, what ethnicity or race you belong to, or what your occupation is. It doesn't matter how much you work out or how healthy you eat. It doesn't matter how many calories you take in or how good your gene pool is. Death is inevitable. And when death comes, sorrows abound. This is something all of us are aware of in this room, and it's certainly, sorry, there's a fly jumping around my face up here. It's certainly something that Naomi is experiencing in her own life. The death of her son, Mahlon, is bad enough, but the death of her second son, Chilion, is even worse. The death of her husband shatters her life, and there is no hope, at least in her perspective. And this is the situation that we find ourselves in within the first couple of verses within the book of Ruth today. And as we look at this, what we need to specifically identify and realize is how she responds to all of these surroundings, all of these predicaments, all of these sorrows that have affected her life. Because ultimately, at the end, what we see is a woman who is really living in despair. And we can kind of understand this, and we need to have a little pity on her. When her husband and her two sons died, brothers and sisters, this brought about a very despairing outlook for the future. First of all, there would be no heir to the family name. That was something that was a real big tragedy in the culture of Israel in that day. And second, it was apparent that Naomi was too old to have any more sons. Those days had passed her. And because of that, her hope of being remarried was very, very slim. A lot of men didn't marry women just to cook and clean for them. They married women so that they would have heirs to their namesake, especially those living in rural areas where they needed sons to help raise up the livestock or help with agricultural means. Because Naomi is beyond those childbearing years, the likelihood of her being remarried was very, very small. And finally, the Moabite women that had married Mahlon and Chilion, their prospect of being remarried in a foreign nation of Israel was also very poor. And so it looked like this whole entire event that had transpired over the duration of this great famine, recorded in 1:1, has set the stage for utter hopelessness. But brothers and sisters, one of the greatest lessons that we need to learn from the book of Ruth is that although sorrows happen, we should never lose hope. But this is where she is. In fact, if you jump into verse 13 of chapter 1, we see that even more. She says to her two daughters as she asks them to leave her and go back to Moab, not to come along with her to Israel. She says these words, "No, my daughters, it's harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me," she says. Now, we need to understand what the implications of this verse actually say to us. First is this, the term that she implores here in this sentence, that the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me, is actually in the same connotation of that as an army that's going out of its home base with hostile intentions. Naomi is saying, God has marched against me. He's fighting against me, and I can't stand against him. She's saying that she has no source of being rescued. Second, she is embittered by God. If you actually go down to chapter 1, verse 20, we actually see another expression of her despair that she's in right now. When the women come out and they see Naomi and they meet her and greet her, Naomi has actually very bitter words for them. She says, "No, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt with me very bitterly." And what she means by that is the word Mara actually is the word bitter. You see, she has now identified herself differently. Naomi was filled. Naomi was happy. Naomi had hope. Naomi had a husband. Naomi had two sons. Naomi was completely filled with hope, and God had blessed her. But now here, years later, she returns and she labels herself with an identity of despair, of discouragement, and of depression. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for God has made my life bitter. You know, brothers and sisters, what a great time to stop and look at a lesson here. Sorrows abound in this world that we live in. And as they abound in this world that we live in, what we need to recognize, what we need to realize is that we should never get to a point of despair like she is in. Now, she's hurting, and grief has set upon her, and now the prospect of her two daughter-in-laws to also leave her is looming before her. And the one good positive note we can really say about Naomi is that although misery loves company, she's not willing to go down that road. She isn't going to bring her two daughters down this road of despair with her. And so that's a very positive note. And another positive note is that she still believes in God. She believes God is present. She believes that God is real. But brothers and sisters, she's hurting right now. And really, she's angry. She's bitter with God. And because of that, there's separation in their relationship. And sometimes we can get to that point, and if we're in that point for very long, it creates a heart of absolute hopelessness, and I think that's where she is right now. She's just really, really struggling. And so the Naomi who was alive when she left Bethlehem is now the Naomi who has died with her husband and her two sons. This world that we live in can certainly leave us angry and bitter. But brothers and sisters, we must always recognize that God is in control. And that's exactly what chapter 1 is already pointing us towards. Because at the end of chapter 1, verses 16 through 19, what we see is that she is bitter, but she has really no right to be. Now, I'm not saying that she shouldn't have sorrow. That's not what I'm saying. But brothers and sisters, what Naomi doesn't realize is that God has woven in her life somebody that is greater than all the sons that she could ever have. She has a daughter-in-law who loves her, who cares for her, and who is not going to leave her. And even when Naomi commands her, go, Ruth, go, and live a different life, Ruth says, no, I'm all in. I'm going to be with you. And what we see is that God has weaved within the life of Naomi, who is in a point of despair right now, a redeemer. And that's our second point. Naomi finds a redeemer in Ruth. Chapter 1, verse 16 and 19. It's one of the most beautiful statements in our Bible, and a lot of people know it, and we should know it because it's a fantastic one. For verse 16 says this, and Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death departs from you and me. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So they both went until they came to Bethlehem. Brothers and sisters, Naomi may feel like she has no hope, but God has already assured her that she does. And so what a fantastic story here. And the beauty of Ruth's statement is really composed of 6 major elements. First, she pleads with Naomi not to leave her. Second, she affirms in her determination to go where Naomi will go and to stay where Naomi will stay. Third, she realizes and she chooses to separate herself from her people. She was not blind to the reality that if I go with Naomi, I will probably never return to see my own family. And yet she was willing to go for the sake of Naomi. And so she put all of her future aspirations, she put future marriages, she put future prospect of having children, she put her own future security on the shelf so that she could maybe bring hope to Naomi. What a fantastic and godly woman this is. And yet she's a Moabite. But if we continue on, we will see that fourth, her statement is also laden with religious implications. For when she says, your God will be my God, brothers and sisters, she uses the formal name of God here, Yahweh, which is the name that God used to reveal himself in the burning bush to Moses. I am what I am, God says. That's his formal name. It's Yahweh. I am who I am. And Ruth has realized who this God is, even in the midst of despair, even though when she herself could be very bitter by the circumstances of her life, she refuses to do that, and she says, your God is my God. Yahweh is the one I believe in. What an incredible confession of faith. Her trust in God is real and it's unwavering. Fifth, she will die where Naomi dies. And finally, she calls down upon a curse if she does not go the distance. Brothers and sisters, what we see is the loyal love of Ruth for Naomi. And it's one of the greatest characteristics that she has, but it's a characteristic that flows directly from God himself. Brothers and sisters, although Naomi feels embittered, although Naomi feels like God is against her, although Naomi feels that God has marched against her, brothers and sisters, God loved Naomi. And through the raising up of Ruth, who has a loyal love about her, God shows his loyal love to Naomi through this loyal servant. Brothers and sisters, are you a loyal friend and love your neighbor in such a way that they do not want to depart from you? Is that a characteristic that we have today? Ruth's words are amazing, but they're not devoid of action either. As she returns with Naomi to Bethlehem, she sets about the busyness of providing for her mother. And I think that's really what we should call her at this point. She's no longer a mother-in-law. She really is, in the eyes of Ruth, she is my mother, and I'm going to take care of her. What a wonderful relationship. As was in the custom of the day, during the gleaning season, the Jews were commanded in the Mosaic law to leave some sheaves behind for the needy and impoverished. That's seen in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 9. Fortunately, the daughter-in-law who gives Naomi a glimmer of hope of redemption has found herself in a righteous man's field who happens to be a relative of Naomi. Welcome to introduction of Boaz. God here is weaving a fantastic picture of redemption and hope in the lives of these women, although they do not see it yet. And so we now come to the third and critical part of this story, that Ruth herself finds a redeemer in Boaz. In the same way that Naomi needs Ruth, Ruth is also in a predicament. She needs her own redeemer. She needs someone who will have pity on her. She needs someone who can help her along in this path because she cannot do it on her own. And so it is in the amazing way that God and God alone acts. He meticulously weaves a redeemer to this redeemer of Naomi. And Boaz comes into the picture, and he is everything that every woman would swoon about. Oh, Boaz. Yes, it's that kind of a guy, ladies. And it's something that we see and we can understand why. He is that man in shining armor, that knight who comes to the rescue. Because while he sees Ruth, he inquires about her, and he's like, who is this woman in my field? And they tell him all of the wonderful deeds of Ruth. And so Boaz wants to show generosity to her, and he goes to her in chapter 2:11, where we pick up the story. And Boaz said to Ruth, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me. And how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward you for your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Now, Boaz has incredible insight here. His words display a righteous man. His words display a fantastic element that we should not overlook. Because within this section and moving onward even into chapter 3 and 4, what we see is that he blesses and asks God to reward Ruth. And brothers and sisters, God will answer that prayer. How? by raising up Boaz to be the answer to it. How will Ruth be blessed? She needs somebody who will redeem her. And who will come and rescue her and redeem her? It will be Boaz. Boaz's prayer is actually answered by God in the works of Boaz. What a fantastic God. Second, Boaz provides for her. At times you'll say, hey, make sure that you leave a little extra in the fields as you're gleaning it for Ruth. Let her take as much as she wants. In fact, give her a double portion of it. And at the same time, what we also see is this, is that he will also invite her to his own table. Chapter 3, verse 14. There he will protect her when she's out in the field. Now remember, brothers and sisters, women didn't work out in the fields. And so for her to be out in the fields, it would risk reputation. It would also risk her own health, her own security, because she's surrounded by a lot of men. And when you're out in the field, who knows what can happen? But Boaz says, you are not to touch her, and lays a hedge of protection around her. And then at the beginning of chapter 4, he will redeem her through marriage. Boaz comes to the rescue and gives Ruth and Naomi a redeemer. At the end of this story, Ruth actually will bear a son to Boaz. His name will be Obed. In reaction to God's blessing, we now come full circle to the woman who has said, call me Mara. For brothers and sisters, in the end of this story, as Naomi bounces this little baby, Obed, on her lap, the women pronounce a blessing upon her to help her realize that God was never actually against her. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. And the woman said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. This small little book is one that all of us can love and enjoy. Yet let's make sure that we understand the origin of that hope. For the story of Ruth is not really about Ruth, brothers and sisters, although it is recorded as her namesake. She does a fantastic job. She sacrifices. She is selfless. She is loyal in her love and devotion. And brothers and sisters, we too should understand and know that, and we too should be exactly like her. But the story isn't actually about Ruth. And the story isn't about Naomi. Yes, Naomi has all these privileges, all these blessings, and in her life it starts off so well, but it ends so disastrously, at least in the first end of the chapter 1 that we looked at, and it looks like despair, and it looks like everything is going wrong. And yet at the very end, what we find is that she has been redeemed, that she has Boaz, that she has Obed, that she has Ruth, who are loyal to her and have helped her through this despairing situation. And now she is filled. She again has hope. She again has a future. But the story isn't about Naomi either. And it's not about Boaz. And Boaz he's a good man, a righteous man, a faithful man, a man who is generous, a man who saw somebody in need and took care of them. And God weaved within his life a love for this Moabite woman who had given her life to God, who had pledged her service to her mother-in-law and said, this is the kind of wife I want. And because of it, God blessed him as one of the ancestors of King David. But the story isn't about Boaz. The story, brothers and sisters, point number 4, is about God. The book of Ruth is God's book about himself. And that truth is so important for us to understand. For God reveals himself wondrously to this family and to us today. And as he reveals these characteristics. First, that he is always present in the midst of suffering. We may feel like God is not present. We may feel like God is absent. We may feel exactly like Naomi feels, but that is not reality. The reality is that God was present in this entire situation from beginning to end. And God had woven together a picture of redemption, which is our second characteristic. Naomi is afflicted, and so she needs help, so God moves Ruth into her life. And Ruth needs help, so God moves Boaz into her life. God is always moving, always redeeming. Third, it reveals that God is a God who brings hope to us sometimes by raising up faithful friends. Are you a faithful friend to others? You know, one of the greatest concepts of the Bible is to love your neighbor as yourself. But sometimes that concept of being neighborly, we can misunderstand that today in American culture. Really, it means, are you a good friend? You know, in my experience, especially in Holton, I've had numerous people come to me and say, I just can't find friends. And I wonder at the end if they can't find friends because they don't show friendship like Ruth. If you're lacking in friendship, then be a servant like she was. Because at the end of the day, when you find people like this, brothers and sisters, who will come and lay down their life and be like, I'm coming, I'm helping no matter what. Boy, they are a treasure to have. Do you have and are you a friend? God uses faithful friends to bring hope. Next, God is the center of not only the book of Judges, not only the entire Bible, not only the book of Ruth, but also we could say that he is the center of our families, or at least should be. Because here it is, in the midst of the national identity and crisis that Israel was going through this cyclical pattern of sin, what we see is God took time to care for a family. God loves our families. Do you love your family so much that you would propel them into a relationship with God for all of eternity? And finally, it reveals that God is sovereign. He is the universal God who works not only in Israel, but he also worked in Moab as well. You see, the story of the book of Ruth is an amazing one. It shows us the sovereignty of God as he works in our lives, even in the midst of problems and even to unassuming, unimportant people like Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. God surprises us, even in the midst of a total, moral, chaotic, confusing society called Israel at this day. Brothers and sisters, God continues to work through us. We don't have to be the President of the United States to bring about revival. We can just bring about a revival to our families and to our close friends. This little story is a precursor to what will happen in the same town of Bethlehem to an unassuming couple named Mary and Joseph nearly 1,000 years later. You see, God has woven this timeless narrative into the ancestral line of King David and brothers and sisters, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, who replaces him, Jesus Christ, as expressed in Matthew chapter 1. And so, if anything we remember today is that God is the sovereign God who brings hope to us through his redeeming qualities. And brothers and sisters, of all times, of all the spiritual decline and moral depravity in our society and our culture, we can still cling to hope because God is still at work.